Hey everyone, welcome back to the HC Conversations podcast. My name is Phil. This is Paul.
Yes, I'm Paul.
Beat you to it this time.
Thanks.
Hope everybody is doing great on this. Well, this is going to release usually on a Wednesday, but wherever you're watching this, hope you are doing well. We are here to hang out for a few minutes. We're going to recap this past week's message, maybe add a few extra thoughts, and then share some thoughts at the end of this podcast as we usually do. So, with that said, let's jump in. Paul.
Yes.
This past Sunday at church, as we continued on in the not-so-secret sauce, why don't you tell the good people what we talked about?
Well, so we talked about the fact that Peter instructs us to add to our faith goodness. We talked about doing the good works that God prepared in advance for us to do, that we're unleashing the good works of Jesus upon the world. And then we talked about the fact that we need to have knowledge to our faith. So knowledge, this idea of fearing the Lord, that's the beginning of wisdom. And then we talked about that we need to have self-control. That self-control is how we basically live out all the other virtues. That unless we can control ourselves in the way of Jesus, then there's no reason or no ability then for us to follow Jesus unless we harness our fleshly desires. And then yesterday we talked about perseverance, that we need to have endurance, perseverance when it comes to the faith, and we look to Hebrews chapter 12, that the writer before this chapter that we looked at talked about all the people that had gone before us in the faith, that they never saw Jesus, they never saw the thing that they had hoped for, but yet they endured to the end. And so the idea then is how much more then can we endure since we have Jesus, we have the faith, we have all these people that have gone before us in the faith.
Yeah, very good.
So that's kind of like the overall crux of the message, and the writer points out that we need to look to Jesus, that we have this great cloud of witnesses that have surrounded us, that are waiting for us at the finish line, that they're witnesses, this idea that they're not just spectators, they're not just sitting idly by, but no, they were actively in the race, they're now at the finish line, they're encouraging us, waiting for us to cross the finish line with them, to say, you have what it takes, you can do it because I finished the race.
Yeah, I loved Sunday when you were talking about that, like that idea of connecting the race that we're running, right? New Testament authors use that imagery a lot, to run your race, to finish the race. And the cloud of witnesses that they've also run the race, right? Like they just got done running.
Right.
And that idea, like you'll see this with marathons and different things. A lot of times someone gets done running and they start cheering on those who are coming in. Or when you mentioned it, I thought, like, I grew up playing sports. One of the things, especially like conditioning for football, you always had the guys that would finish first and the people that were still running. And as soon as you got done, the coaches would always instruct. And that it would start with the coaches telling you to do it, and then eventually it just caught on. Yeah. You would start cheering on your teammates, even so much so to the point that it's like you finished the race and now you go back and like you run alongside them and like cheer them the whole way. I was like, oh my gosh, like when you made that connection, I'm like, oh yeah, the great cloud of witnesses, they're not people in the stands cheering you on. They're the ones that have run as well. And they're like, we just finished, now it's your turn to finish. Yeah, so that's cool.
And it's a beautiful picture of this great cloud of witnesses. It's this picture of there's so many people that have finished the race that it covers the entire expanse of the sky, that you can't distinguish one from the other. It's like a cloudy day where it's like all you see is clouds, that you cannot pick out one cloud from another. Yeah. But there's so many people that have run the race before us that it's just like, wow.
Yeah, you drew that out because we had a day like that last
recently.
Week. It was just like, it seemed like
today's like that too.
Yeah, but it was a couple days ago. It just seemed like, it was like 2:00 in the afternoon. I'm like, is it nighttime? It was so dark. It was because just cloud everywhere. It's basically going to be like the next 5 months here in Northeast Ohio. But it's like, just a whole blanket across the sky where it's just like one giant, those who've come before us.
Right,
so.
But right in the middle of the cloud of witnesses is we have Jesus.
Yeah.
He's the author, the trailblazer, the pioneer, the perfecter of our faith, the one that blazed a trail, that cleared out the trail for us to run. And because Jesus is at the end cheering for us, like we need to keep our eyes fixed on him. The moment that we turn our head to the side, we begin to get off course. We begin to trip up, and the author says, to cast aside everything, including the sin that so easily entangles. Before I go any further, you look like you want to say something.
Well, Christy and I, when you said that, like, you got to keep your eyes straight forward, like looking ahead, and she and I both started laughing and talking to each other because when you said that, Braxton played football for the first time this year. And he had just this really bad habit. Like when they would be running at the end of practice, he's wanting to look around and see what his teammates are doing. And so inevitably, like he would start at one spot, and by the time he finished, he was like way over off to the side somewhere. Because like, yeah, if you don't have that focal point ahead of you, and he wasn't running as fast because you're just kind of like flailing along if you're not locked in ahead. And so that was another image that you just brought to light. I was like, yep, seen that. It just also makes me think as well. It's like, hey, you run the race marked out for you. Keep your eyes ahead. Not only does the sin and weight entangle us, which I think you're about ready to talk about, but also when we're looking around at other people who are running the race as well, it's like, don't pay attention to their race.
Yeah, we're going to start tripping over them. We're going to start slowing other people down.
Yeah, they've got their race to run. You've got your race to run.
Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus.
Yeah, that's where that phrase comes from, right? Stay in your lane. Literally, that comes from running and track. You have lanes that you have to stay in, or else not only are you not going to finish well, somebody else over there is not going to finish well either, because there's going to be a pile up.
So keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. And so many times in our life, we can take our eyes off Jesus and begin running off course. But the beautiful thing is that Jesus doesn't move. He stays right there, and that we can fix our eyes once again on Jesus and get back on track and keep running the race. And the author of Hebrews says to us to cast off every weight and the sin that so easily entangles or ensnares us. It's this picture of whenever runners in ancient times would run, they'd enter the stadium in these long flowing robes, and when the race was about ready to begin, they'd cast them aside, they'd throw them to the ground, and they'd run the race naked. And I had a thought earlier, and I'm like, I don't know, this is kind of a half-baked thought, but as Christians, we're to cast aside our sin, that Jesus is the one that then clothes us, that we're clothed in the righteousness of Christ. But to the world, it looks like we're running virtually naked, because the clothing of Jesus, it doesn't look like the clothing that the world provides. Again, I have a thought that I haven't really thought much about, but I'm going to say it anyways.
I love it.
God in the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve, they try to clothe themselves, and they clothe themselves with fig leaves, and God says, "No, I've got
very
something
crude
better for you.
Yep.
I'm going to clothe you with grace, with righteousness." And it looks like vulnerability, it looks like humility to the world, but it's this beautiful thing that's not going to trip us up like the clothing that we provide, that the world says that sin is what clothes us. So we're to cast that aside. Get rid of it. Let Jesus be the one that clothes you, because that's a robe that's not going to tangle around your feet and ensnare you.
Yeah. You want another half-baked thought? If yours was half-baked, I guess that makes mine quarter-baked.
Okay, quarter-baked.
Talk about like Jesus clothing us in his righteousness. And it's like sometimes when runners would run a race, when you get done, there's often a garment they put over you when you're done, right? Like you get clothed like you won, and you kind of draped over your shoulders. And it's like you picture the race that we run as Christians. We finish the race, we get clothed. Hey, you finished, now you're clothed with the righteousness of Jesus. But it's like the timeline of the Christian life is actually, even while you're yet running the race, you've already won the victory. It's like Jesus clothes you with his righteousness and that victory before you've even finished the race. And so like there's that picture, like, yeah, you're still running, but you go ahead and get to wear my righteousness. You get to wear my victory already, even though you still got the race to run.
Yeah.
So,
and we're to cast aside every sin and the weight that so easily entangles us. It's this picture that there's things that have grown over the race, over the path marked out for us, that sometimes it looks like briars that are there to trip us up. It's like a constriction of the path, a narrowing because of the things that we put up or that have been put in our way. So many times it's these things that trip us up, that slow us down, that get us off course. And it's as if we have put them in place for ourselves to slow us down, to get us off track. And the author says, no, cast those things aside. Have nothing to do with them. Get rid of sin. And I think this is part of the reason why so many Christians have trouble running the race, and why there's so much, bad in the church today, is because we tolerate sin so much. We easily tolerate sin because we don't want to be seen as holier than thou. We don't want to be seen as fundamentalist, oppressive. If we say get rid of sin, out of touch with reality, so we end up tolerating sin, embodying sin, and allowing it in the church instead of getting rid of it, instead of following the command of Jesus to be holy as I am holy.
Yeah.
It's just like, get rid of sin at all costs. Cast it aside.
There's one other thing that you said yesterday that I thought was maybe worth repeating here, or maybe shedding some more light on. You talked about endurance, and that we have to run our race with endurance. Like this life that we live, the race that we are running, following Jesus, you got to keep pushing on, right? You got to persevere, you got to endure. I thought it was really interesting, insightful that you talked about how a lot of times as Christians, we think that's a passive endurance. Like just going to kind of bear it, just going to kind of suffer through it until the end comes. But you said, no, it's actually an active endurance. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so...
Because I was like, oh, that's so true.
The picture that the author paints is we're actively running. We just keep on running, and we are actively...
That's right. That's when you made the Forrest Gump reference. I started running.
I started running, and I ran for 3 years.
It's all coming back to me now when you said that. That's right.
Yeah, so it's this idea that we are actively enduring. So many times in the Christian faith, we're taught that endure is just to sit back, to pray about it, just be patient, and trust that God will get you through eventually.
Yeah, just like kind of just sit there and suffer, right?
Yeah,
like
sit
just
there and suffer. It's not that, but that's not at all what the author of Hebrews has in mind. It's active endurance. That I am actively struggling against sin, against the ways of the world, the flesh, and the devil that's come to seek, steal, or that come to steal, kill, and destroy. Yeah. And so it's this picture that we are pushing back actively against these things that are trying to trip us up, and not just sitting back and enduring it just to say, I'm just going to pray about it and just hope that it goes away. It's like, no, I prayed about it. I'm actively doing something now against it.
You keep moving forward on the race, even if it's like at a snail's pace, because like the weight is so much at the time, or it's so heavy, you got to endure so much, but you're still moving forward.
Yeah, and the picture that so many of us have been given is, no, I stopped running the race, and I'm sitting along the sidelines just waiting, just praying, just hoping that, maybe eventually I'll get there. That sin is going to go away, and it's like, no, we keep on enduring, we keep working, we keep pressing forward.
I think we think in like endurance is, okay, I'm going to endure through this season, through whatever this thing is, this spiritual thing, like, and then once I have endured through that, then I'll start running again, right? But like you said, that's not what the passage says. No, you endure as you're running. Right. And the danger is too, it's like, man, if we have that mentality, number one, not to be negative, but you don't know if that season ever is going to end. Right. Like there might not be when I get through this, then I'll start running my race again. It's like, no, whatever that thing is, it might be your whole life. And if you do get through it, there's going to be something else. And there's going to be something else. There's going to be something else. And so it's like we endure while we're running. Yep. I think that is so important because there has been, I think, an overcorrection in like society and in the church as it relates to endurance and suffering and like making it through. Years ago, decades ago, right? It was kind of, for a while, it was just like, yeah, if you're just basically ignore what you're going through. And that was, instead of enduring, like endurance, I think involves a recognition that I am, like this is hard, I am going through it, but I'm still pushing forward. And so the extreme was just ignore it, push through, even if it's really, really unhealthy. And now I feel like we've swung to the other extreme that's like, oh, you just rest, you need some self-care and self-love, and you just sit on the sideline for a while. You're running the race, and like, yeah, here's a little pit stop, sit down. Have you ever seen, like when people run marathons, this is actually a good example, they get water breaks and drink breaks and stuff, but people are handing it to them as they're running. Yeah. Like they don't actually stop and be like, need a breather. Now, if you're not like a trained runner, obviously, yes, you're not going to do that. But like, so we've almost come too far where it's just like, yeah, it's okay. It's okay to pull back from the race that you're running. It's okay to pull back from your faith. It's okay to pull back from your faith community or your church or whatever that looks like. And you just focus on you for a while.
And the author says,
there ain't nowhere in the Bible anywhere. There's no you focus on you for a while.
Keep on running. You keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. And that's what helps us to endure, to keep on going. Because look to Jesus, the author, the perfecter, the one that went before us, so that way now we can run because he finished the race. Now that enables us to finish the race. And not only do we have the great cloud of witnesses cheering us on, but we have Jesus himself cheering us on, saying, you can do it. You can keep on going. And then I didn't talk much about verse 4, but I touched on it briefly. But the author says, none of us have struggled against sin so much that we have shed our blood like Jesus.
Yeah,
Jesus. So
Jesus' endurance is like way out.
What are you whining and complaining about? Look to Jesus because he finished.
He finished well.
He finished well.
Yeah.
And because he finished well, we can also finish.
Yeah, I think there's just that idea. It's like, yeah, even if for this season you're running at, it's an inch an hour. It's just like painstakingly slow, but you're still running. You're still moving. There's that idea of pacing. Like I'm not a runner.
I'm not either. That's why I didn't use too many running illustrations.
But people who run, like they know how it's like, okay, there's at certain points in the race, I pace myself at different because I know what it is to endure and what I need to get through this. So there's going to be times when it's like my pace on my race has slowed down, but it never stops. Like you still keep moving forward.
Yeah, because for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, despising its sin and shame. He sat down at the right hand of God the Father.
Yeah.
And it's this picture of Jesus sitting at God's right hand. It was not a position that he earned. It was given to him freely by God, but it's because of the faithfulness of Jesus. And now Jesus sits there ready, willing to help us, to encourage us along the way.
Yeah.
And then I jumped to Philippians, where Paul was instructing the church at Philippi to have the same mindset that Jesus Christ had, that he in himself was very nature God, but he didn't consider that something to be used to his own advantage, but instead he emptied himself.
Yep.
That we find life, we finish the race not by somehow like trying to use our position for our own advantage, but rather we empty ourselves out. And in doing so, we mimic Christ. We find that there's life, and we can endure in doing so.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah, and it just hit me too, like that endurance. You keep your eyes on Christ, who's like at the end. He's like, I'm looking to him, cheering him on. But he's not just at the end cheering you on, you're looking towards him. He's also the one that is making it so you can even run and endure it through his Spirit, right? And so it's like, both at the end of the race, my eyes are on him, and in the race, he, through his Spirit, is the one who is actually empowering me to even run this thing.
Yeah. I just had a thought, going back to the passive endurance that so many of us have been taught. It's this picture of contrasting that with the active endurance. It's us saying, Jesus is trying to help us, trying to encourage us along the way, and we're sitting back saying, no, Jesus, I don't need your encouragement. I got this. I can do this on my own. And Jesus is like, no, like, get up, keep going. It's like, no, I just want to sit back and care for myself a little bit.
Yeah.
It's just like, what a scorn is that to Jesus and to the work that he's done for us. To just try for passive endurance instead of active endurance.
Had to check my phone, text message.
That's right.
I'm on baby watch right now. Speaking of enduring, Christy has been enduring for a while. It's no baby, so that's not what that was. But it was Christy, but it was not about, hey. So anyway. All right, anything else on yesterday's? Every single week. We almost made it through. This past week, yesterday. It was yesterday. Anything else on the message from this week?
So I landed the plane then with how we can endure in our lives. Number one, confess our sins, repent of it, turn from your sin, cast it aside.
That's one of the ways we get rid of the weight, is like getting it out there.
Yeah, so get rid of your sin, cast it away, be holy as Jesus is holy. And the beautiful thing is that Jesus also is the one that makes us holy. It's both, that we are trying to be holy and Jesus makes us holy. We're going to talk about that this or next week as we talk about godliness. And then I said we need to surround ourselves with the communion of saints. So, being part of a community. Yeah. And then I talked about being part of also a worshiping community, that the church has always been a gathered people, that something happens and we develop that rhythm in our life that pushes back against the patterns of sin that are beginning to creep in. So do those things, and we can hopefully endure to the end as we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus.
Yes.
So
very nice. Very good.
So that's a bow on that part. I said something yesterday in the message that we wanted to talk about a little bit more. And that was this idea of progressive Christianity. That progressive Christianity teaches us to imitate Jesus, to just look to Jesus as a great example. But it says subtly and sometimes not so subtly is that, look to Jesus, but you don't really need Jesus because Jesus was just a great example.
He's an example. He's a teacher.
Yeah. So you can adopt activism. That can be a mark of righteousness. So be a political activist, be a social activist. Do these things and hope that those are the things that save you. You can vote the right way. You can try to be on the right side of history.
Quote, whatever that means.
Quote, right side of history, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
Instead, what that actually ends up looking like is colonization of people groups and ideas that, and self-righteousness, and not actually trusting in Jesus to be the one that saves us. And conversely, on the other side, we can focus so much on grace that we don't, or on on grace, that we don't try to imitate Jesus.
Yeah.
It's like, no, Jesus is the one that saves me. That's
So I don't have to do anything
it's
now.
like, no, we need both.
Yeah. Yeah, it's as you talk about kind of the progressive end of things. It's interesting. I need Jesus as an example. I need him as a teacher, but I don't. Basically, what it says is I don't need him for salvation, because progressive Christianity very much denies the idea of sin. That Orthodox Christianity would say no, like sin is an innate problem for every human. We are not basically good. You talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And as hard as we try with our efforts, even looking to Jesus as an example or looking to his teacher, to him as a teacher, I can't fix me.
Right.
I need something outside of me to save me. So as we talk about this, and the reason that we're talking about this is we see this not just us, like it has crept into the church a lot of different places, and with the proliferation. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, sure.
Of information, like it's just kind of on the internet, right? Where it's just like you don't necessarily know. I see something that sounds good, but what's the source that it's coming from? What are they like? Is there, excuse me, something behind that? Is there an agenda behind that? A lot of times, because I've even seen this, like, oh, that sounds really good. And then you dig a little deeper. I'm like, they're kind of trying to smuggle in some thoughts or ideas that aren't orthodox. And so, like, how would you even define progressive Christianity? Because it's a word that we throw around, and I think people are like, what do you mean progressive Christianity?
Christianity, like I said earlier, that doesn't really need Jesus. Jesus is a good example, but he's not Savior, he's not Lord. It's Christianity without sin, that says, yeah, sure, there's some bad people out there, but it's certainly not in me, because I'm a good person, and it doesn't try to do anything about holiness, be holy as I am holy. It's just like, no, we have adopted the definition of love that the culture has. It's hijacked the biblical idea of love and says, no, love is love. It's whatever we want to make it. We can
Circular reasoning.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a definition. Love is not a definition. Like, you still haven't defined what love is. Yes.
And so it's ultimately a Christianity that's godless and powerless.
Yeah, and I think there's varying degrees too, right? On like, it's like a sliding scale, because on like the far extreme of what we would say like progressive Christianity is like would basically deny any kind of miraculous, any kind of divinity of Jesus, the exclusivity of Jesus. Would basically like, hey, all roads kind of lead to God, but we like the Jesus veneer one and those kind of things. A lot of times, like you said, with the downplaying of sin, and specifically the death of Jesus on the cross, what did it accomplish? A lot of times a progressive Christianity angle will be like, well, Jesus was the victim of oppressive systems, of religious and governmental systems. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but the biblical picture very clearly portrays Jesus wasn't a victim of anything. He willingly chose to go to the cross. Like, the cross did not happen to him. It was his plan. It was God's foreknowledge to say, humans are sinful. I will atone for that. So, yeah, a lot of times more progressive Christianity will kind of sweep that under the rug. And oftentimes in our current moment, everything is so political. A lot of times progressive Christianity is just a Christian veneer painted over like the secular left, where it's like, I like more left-leaning, secular, progressive politics, but I'm a Christian, so let me put slap a little Jesus on that. It's interesting that oftentimes it's the Christian right that gets painted that way. Like, you're trying to put Jesus over your politics. I'm like, dude, the Christian left is just as guilty, if not more. It's like, yeah, it's very insidious.
We were talking earlier about, there's people that masquerade around as Orthodox Christians, but when you dig a little bit deeper, you can see that it's progressive Christianity.
Yes.
An Orthodox veneer, trying to say that, well, this is what Christians have always believed, and they're wolves in sheep's clothing, and that gets thrown around a lot in the church, and trying to well, clearly fundamentalists, those are wolves in sheep's clothing. It's like, no, they're very obviously, like, they're not necessarily hiding the fact that of what they are, but it's like the progressive Christians is very much it's easier to hide that, because they're like,
it feels
loving,
better.
We're
Exactly. It
passionate,
feels better.
We're the nice people, and that can easily trick people into buying the goods that they're selling.
Yes. It's so I like. I don't want to, because we could go down a list of like, hey, like this person, this, like it's not an unending list. We just need to be wise enough to know when to see it. But there's a few in particular. It's like I'll see something, I'll see it in my own feed. It's usually a social media thing, or it'll be shared, or it'll be sent to me, and it's like a variety of different voices. I'm like, on the surface, that sounds good. But then if you start to ask, okay, what do you mean when you say that? What do you mean? And you go down the rabbit hole, you'll find, I mean, just even on like the person's own page, you're like, whoa, you are saying things that are, again, you would deny a lot of the 2,000-year-old like historic Christian tenets. And so things will be specifically called out a lot of times. And again, it ends up being a veneer for particular political positions, where right now there is a lot of, let me paint it with like this Jesus thing. You should, like, Jesus cared about, and the Bible is all about the poor and the foreigner and the oppressed and the orphan and the widow and all of those kind of things. Here, like, read the Old Testament prophets and how much they care about justice for the marginalized and the oppressed and all of that. And I'm like, that certainly is true. Man, the Old Testament prophets have an awful lot to say also about holiness and about the sexual sin that was happening in Israel, and about, the sacrificing of children to like Molech and others like that in Israel. It's like, we don't get to just portray one side of this. Like this is.
And the ironic thing is that those that hold this position and try to say, well, what the church needs to do now is we need to care after the orphans, the widowed, the oppressed, is they would say, America's not a Christian.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I want
the church to operate as if it is a Christian nation. And you're not reading scripture in context, because if you look back at the prophets and the minor prophets, who were they talking to? They were talking to Israel,
the people of God,
and commanding the people of God to carry out the commands of God, to actually love the widow, the orphan, the oppressed. And it seems like if we're going to apply that, then let's look at the church today. Is the church caring for its own widows, orphaned, and the oppressed?
Yes. Yeah, the Old Testament, New Testament distinction like there is.
The church is actually pretty good at caring for its own.
Absolutely.
And it's like.
Not that the church doesn't do a great job this all the time either, but like even not just caring for its own, the Christians far outweigh in terms of who gives the most to charitable organizations, who adopts the most, who does actually look for the poor, the orphan, it's like, it's Christians. Like, so like that is often thrown up as fodder as being like, well, Christians, you need to love the poor, the orphan. It's like statistically compared to everybody else. I'm not saying that we should compare ourselves to everybody else. I'm just saying Christians do a better job than anybody else in those areas. I'm so glad you brought that up.
So you dig a little bit deeper. It's like, I can tell what you're saying is that Christians need to adopt a progressive mindset, a secular progressive mindset in how we approach politics and caring for people.
Yes, that's one of the things. Man, it's like mind link. Because I was just thinking this last week about this very same people usually who will say, will want to quote the Old Testament prophets about justice for the oppressed and the marginalized, are the very same people that say, hey, but we're not a Christian nation. We don't want Christian ideals enforced upon everyone. I'm like, well, you can't have both of those.
No, because you're just saying that we need to. No, we don't.
Yeah, like it's like, okay, if you want to be a Christian nation and enforce like on a political, national, governmental level, like poor, orphan, widow, those kind of biblical principles, it's like, well, then we're Christian. Like it's one or the other. You don't get to pick which morality you like in the Bible and which you don't, and then get to apply sparingly. As we were talking earlier about this, the thing that I kind of mentioned, it gets brought up a lot, is oftentimes this is veiled in love your neighbor as yourself. You're supposed to love your neighbor. You're supposed to love your neighbor. You're supposed to love your neighbor. I'm like, that's true. Absolutely. But before I love my neighbor, I need to know what love is. I want to know what love is. I'm so glad we both went there. I'm so glad.
Like pretty much on key.
I know. I'm telling you, we're linked today. But it's like, okay, yeah, Jesus does say love your neighbors yourself. And actually, Jesus doesn't just say that. That comes from the Old Testament law. That comes from an obscure passage in Leviticus, of all places. And so, like, you don't just get to throw, we want to throw love your neighbor as yourself around and then say, and I get to be the one that defines what loving my neighbor actually looks like. Right? When Jesus is pressed on, hey, what's the most important thing? He says, here's what it is. And he quotes the Shema, love the Lord your God. Hear Israel, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. We take those two. Jesus says, okay, love God and love your neighbor. All right? It's not number one is love God, number two is love your neighbor. It's like 1 and 1A. You love God and you love your neighbor. we want to take that and say, okay, see, you love God and love your neighbor. They're both equal. And yes, they are both equal in terms of faithfulness and how we live. We love God and we love our neighbor. But definitionally, they are not. Definitionally, they have to come in order. I have to love God first and know who he is and what he requires of me and what truth is. I have to be there before I can even know how to love my neighbor. I don't know. How do I know what I'm doing towards my neighbor is loving or harming them if I don't know the source of all good and all love and all truth? Because again, you take that to a parenting metaphor, it's like, no, there are things that from a kid's perspective may not seem loving from a parent, but the parent knows this is what is actually good for you. And so like we have to know and love God first, and love for neighbor flows out of that. And then Jesus says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two, right? Yep. Love God and love your neighbor. We then want to take that statement, all the law and the prophets hang on this, and then redefine basically the entire Old Testament based on that statement, based on our definition of love. When really what Jesus is saying is like, everything that has been said in the law and prophets is actually summarized by these two things. So to know what these two things are, loving God and loving neighbor, you actually need to go back and read all the law in the prophets and who God is and what he has done through the story of Israel. It's like Jesus' statement doesn't redefine all of Scripture. No, Scripture actually informs what Jesus means when he says, love God and love your neighbor. And it's just like it gets hijacked and weaponized to be like, well, if you're a Christian who is not loving your neighbor in the way that I think you should love your neighbor on the very progressive side, then you're the problem. And it gets hijacked on the right too. There's definitely a fundamentalist conservative Christian stream that hijacks love your neighbor to mean basically, tough love. I'm just going to tell you the truth and never meet any physical needs. And it's like, nope, can't do that. Just can't do that. Like anybody who is just trying to take some Jesus paint and slap it on their politics or slap it on their worldview, it's like, oh man, Jesus would have some words for that.
Yeah, so our point here, for those of you watching or listening,
yep,
is to be careful.
Yes.
To do a little homework, to do a little digging.
If you see something you like, go find some other things that person has said or contributed or whatever.
Yeah, and look at the whole picture of what they're trying to say instead of just, oh, I like this one post, and then start buying into what they're selling you and be shaped by them.
And part of that too is not just doing homework into the person. Like you got to do homework into the biblical story. Yeah. Because when it's like, hey, well, here's what these verses say, here's what these books say, here's the thrust of the prophets or whatever, and it's like, do we know the story of Scripture well enough, like the whole theme, to know? Wait a minute. Is that true, or are you interpreting that through a particular lens with a particular bent? It's like, so we got to be students of Scripture and understand, again, who God is before I can know how to go any further with that. That was fun.
We're going to talk some more about that next week.
Godliness. It's exciting. Looking forward to it.
So join us back here next week as we talk about godliness.
Yeah, see you guys. See what happens.
Okay.
I don't have a thought one way or another.
Okay.
I'm just here to welcome the people.
Welcome.
Just like this. 3,
people.
2, 1. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the HC Let's try that again.